Hello everybody and welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today I have some more tests for you, talking about the recent buff to rapid fire frame sniper rifles in this mid-season patch. But before we begin, I've got the timestamps below with all the sections as usual, and if you like what I do, a like and sub do go a long way to helping me out, and it'll help you keep up to date on me putting out new videos. We have a lot to look at in this video, so I don't want to waste any more of your time. Let's go ahead and begin. So let's go ahead and start talking about what exactly changed in the mid-season patch for rapid fire sniper rifles. The buff is pretty simple. It was just an increase in ammo reserves on all rapid fire frame snipers by 30%. I actually think this is one of the best possible buffs they could have received, given that for the longest time, rapid fire snipers, the 140 RPM archetype, have struggled with their total damage output across a full reserve, purely due to the fact that their total reserve ammo was just too similar to other sniper rifles that had much more base damage per shot and similar ammo economy. The intrinsic reload buff on an empty magazine had always kept their damage per second values in an okay spot, but the meta was so much more focused on total damage for such a long time that the total damage was really lacking, and that was what was hurting them. There have been some gems here and there, more recently considering things like Cloudstrike's Catalyst giving it triple tap and some good buffs there, but rapid fire snipers as a whole just continue to be considered the least effective sniper archetype. However, with this buff, they now carry considerably more ammo than basically any other special weapon type if we ignore trace rifles. In theory, this should have fixed their greatest weakness, giving them much more total damage output than they did before. But are they really able to compete with other top PvE sniper rifles? After this buff, I think if you look at the numbers, they actually have some pretty impressive potential. Now, for our comparisons, I am going to reference back to a video I made just before Lightfall, where I tested a bunch of special weapons with predictions for their damage values based on the patch notes for the changes that were coming in Lightfall. I tested these post-Lightfall as well, although I didn't make a video on those tests, just to confirm that the values were consistent with our predictions from the previous video. So I'll be referencing a couple of sniper rifles from that video, as no other changes have come to those snipers yet, and so those values should still be consistent with the current state of the game. In that video, the basic conclusion I came to is that the best kinetic slot sniper at the time was definitely Succession, with total damage clocking in at 759,052, and DPS coming in at 33,925 after reloading, which is a little low, but the total damage definitely helped make up for it, especially considering the sniper was not going to be your primary damage output. It was going to be something you swapped to after you were out of heavy. The best energy sniper was probably going to be Fugue 55, which had 911,658 total reserve damage and a DPS value of 30,449. The reason I say probably the best is because Fugue had some lower DPS than some other options, but it did have significantly more total reserve damage, which for the purpose of this video I think is probably the more important stat to take a look at, just since that has always been what rapid fires struggle with, so we'll compare it to something with really good total reserve damage. Cloudstrike was also one of the top performing snipers from that previous video, but since it is affected by this buff, I'm going to be establishing a new baseline for its total damage in this video, so I will not be referring to Cloudstrike's metrics from the previous video. Our testing criteria are also going to be the same as the previous video, where I used a Well of Radiance and Divinity for all of the test numbers. However, there are no loader, reserve, or surge mods used in any of these tests, both on the previous video and the current one. Everything was tested with a boss spec mod, except for Cloudstrike, of course, which cannot equip a mod as an exotic weapon. For the DPS values, I'll be focused on DPS including reloads, since the main strength of rapid-fire snipers is their high DPS when including reload times. Don't forget that for single-shot damage, Succession and Fugue are going to perform much better than any of the rapid-fire snipers here, so if you just need something to break something like a weak point on a raid boss, then definitely I would say go with either a 72 RPM or a 90 RPM sniper over a 140 RPM. But let's go ahead and look at actual values, and I started with the newest sniper on this list, which is actually going to be Irukandji. This is a world drop stasis sniper rifle. It's a viced weapon, which is going to be important in a second. On release, this one seemed incredibly promising since it does have access to both 4th times the charm and firing line. As a viced weapon, it also has Vice Stinger, which although it received a heavy nerf in Lightfall, is still one of the better origin traits for DPS weapons, although not nearly as dominant as it was previously. Now, if it activates, you'll only get 25% of your magazine reloaded instead of the entire thing, which is still a very nice bonus, even though it's been nerfed, because you have to consider that a lot of the other origin traits in the game have little to no effect on damage outputs, whereas Vice Stinger is still going to make your DPS more efficient. After the buff, Irukandji will get 27 shots on a full reserve, which when you then calculate 4th times the charm procs will give you 43 shots total. That's going to hit for 23,622 damage per shot with firing line active, since that's a 20% buff, and that'll give you a full reserve damage total of 1,015,746. This is already much better than Succession, while also having higher DPS at 37,609 with reloads factored in. The other thing I want to point out for the DPS value here, though, is that that is basically going to be the floor of what you can expect, because I calculated this value assuming that Vice Stinger never activates, just for simplicity's sake, so in actual gameplay you can probably expect that to be a little bit higher. Irukandji by itself had a very strong damage output for a 140, but its reloads did feel a little bit sluggish compared to other rapid-fire snipers, although with frame counters and reload calculators, it doesn't seem like it actually is that much slower. I think it's probably just because the Viced sideloading animation is a little odd compared to other snipers, so maybe that also had something to do with it. The actual reload isn't as terrible as it seemed, and if you really feel like you need to speed it up, you can also fix that with things like a reload masterwork if you get lucky, or loader mods, or even Lunafaction boots or a rally barricade if needed. Currently, there's only really one other solid option in the kinetic slot for rapid-fire snipers, and that's going to be Praedyth's Revenge, which, of course, comes from Bolt of Glass. It has always had pretty good DPS, at least on paper, but pretty bad total damage because of its lack of an ammo economy perk, since you'd have to use rewind rounds to get the good DPS, and High Impact Reserves is not the best damage perk, but it's not terrible, in theory at least. High Impact Reserves does have some really odd methods of damage calculations, so I had to use the averages method of taking 20 or so damage phases where I emptied a full reserve, made sure to hit all my shots, then got the average, which for Praedyth's Revenge was now, after the buff, going to be 708,508. That's not bad at all, considering that it's only a little bit lower than Succession, but I'd honestly rather have Succession's slower fire rate and higher impact for such a similar amount of total damage, and the fact that Praedyth's Revenge damage per second isn't really affected by the buff, but for convenience sake I did still calculate it back out, which comes out to around 44,608 damage per second, which is pretty much unchanged from the pre-buff state, since ammo reserves don't have a huge effect on damage per second. It's higher damage per second than Irukandji, but not by much, considering you lose around 300,000 total damage. I don't really think that it's worth it for that slight increase in damage per second for such a big loss in total damage output. So if I had to pick, I'd definitely say Irukandji is the best kinetic slot DPS sniper now, although Succession is definitely still good for things like potentially hitting weak points on raid bosses, just because it has very good, per shot damage, and still not bad as a backup option against bosses, especially considering you're probably not going to be using your sniper as your primary DPS output, just because of how strong heavy weapons are right now. Praedyth's is also not the worst thing in the world, but High Impact Reserves just kind of struggles as a damage perk in my opinion, especially on these weapons compared to the other options we currently have. The thing to think about is that Banshee did actually sell pretty much the god roll of Irukandji earlier this season, so if you happen to pick it up and throw it in your vault, you might still be sitting on it. I'd recommend taking a look to see if you did pick it up. Just as one last thing before we move on to the energy weapons though, just disclaimer for the kinetic slot, Izanagi's Burden is also a very strong option, but since it's going to probably be paired with something else for boss damage, I didn't really want to compare it here since this is basically just going to be the sniper rifles in a vacuum, and Izanagi's behaves very differently to other sniper rifles and is often paired with something else. Just felt like I should probably mention that before I get a comment saying why not just use Izanagi's Burden. But now moving on to the energy slot, we only really have one competitor here for legendary options currently, which is the Ikelos Sniper. I have a crafted one here with 4 times the charm and Focus Fury, which also had to be tested via the averages method that I used for Praedyth's Revenge, since Focus Fury is not always up. Post-buff, it has the same reserve size as Irukandji, 27 base, and then 43 total if you get all your 4th times activations. It hits for 19,562 damage per shot, give or take, depending on if Focus Fury is up or not, and its damage per second is still pretty much unchanged, averaging in at around 41,179. And while that is higher than Irukandji's base DPS, I think it's important to state that Irukandji will likely be matching or beating that value, since you're almost certainly going to be getting those Vice Stinger activations for better efficiency on its magazines, thus reducing the frequency of your reloads, and so Ikelos probably is not going to have quite as much DPS in actuality, but it's going to be very, very close. The other thing I think that's important to point out is that Ikelos has worse total damage than Irukandji, but not by much, coming in at 986,617 total damage after the buff. That's entirely going to be due to Focus Fury not having the same uptime as Firing Line. But what's important to note there is that if you're not able to keep firing line up against a certain boss because you either have to split up or you're maybe in a solo fire team, you can get a lot more value out of Focus Fury since you can activate it entirely on your own, not needing teammates to be near you like firing line does. Ikelos does also have the advantage of being in a completely different slot, so it's not necessarily directly having to compete with Irukandji, since if your build calls for a specific kinetic slot weapon, then Irukandji is not really an option for you, and Ikelos doesn't really have much competition in the energy slot at the moment. Cloudstrike is its only real competitor, and its exotic status means that it's not always a viable option depending on your loadout preference. Maybe you have to run like a Galahorn to buff rockets for your team, or some other exotic weapon somewhere else, and you can't use a Cloudstrike at all. But speaking of Cloudstrike, I think it was probably the biggest beneficiary of this buff, and I also believe that I saved the best for last year, because Cloudstrike was already one of the strongest long-range precision special weapons in the whole game, and it can now carry an impressive 31 rounds without any reserve mods. Your bullets are going to be doing 18,152 per hit, and you're going to get a lightning storm for every 3 precision hits. The lightning storms do their damage in a 2-part burst, with the first strike doing 18,644 damage, and the second strike hitting for 11,187 damage, totaling out to 29,831. With triple tap on the catalyst, you're going to be getting about 44 total shots in reserve and 14 storm activations total. The total reserve damage then will be 1,216,322, which is incredibly high. The damage profile is going to then calculate out to about 798,688 of that damage coming from your bullets, and 417,634 of that damage coming from the lightning. Its damage per second does remain unchanged at 46,012, which is still higher than any other sniper we've discussed thus far, including Irukandji with good Vice Stinger RNG. I actually think Cloudstrike is not a bad option for potential backup damage if you run something like a rocket loadout, since if for whatever reason you don't get much heavy, like it falling off the map, or inability to generate ammo, or simply inability to actually safely get to the ammo and pick it up, you could use this to get some great damage out of a special ammo sniper. Something to think about with Cloudstrike as well is that it has the advantage of being pretty unique among snipers in that a single headshot kill can create a lightning strike, not necessarily the full storm that the 3 will create, but a strike that can do pretty good AoE damage nonetheless. Therefore, you could potentially use it to clear out some adds at distance by getting one quick headshot and then letting the lightning strike thin out a herd of enemies for you, at least a little bit. Never gonna be the best at doing something like that, but it's definitely an advantage to have if you have to run a sniper in your energy slot, especially since Cloudstrike does not have to sacrifice any boss damage potential to get this effect, whereas a lot of snipers, if they were to use something like a Dragonfly perk, you'd have to give up something else, usually a boss damage perk, and you wouldn't have enough damage to match it. But Cloudstrike, it's all one perk, so you should be good to go. However, my friends, we have once again reached that time where I have nothing else for you, so if you liked the video, your support with a like, share, or subscribe are greatly appreciated. And if you ever want to see some streams, my Twitch channel is linked down below. As always, thank you all so much for watching. I won't waste any more of your time, and I will see you guys in the next one. Later, everybody.